It's week 13 of the fantasy football season, and that means you have 2 more chances to make a run for your playoff berth. So to help you set the ideal lineup, I'm bringing in SI senior fantasy analyst Michael Fabiano. Fabs, it's getting down to the wire. I'm looking at your list here. For your QB starts of the week, you have a guy on the list that was phenomenal actually on Sunday for fantasy, and he's once again in the game with the highest game total of the week at SI Sportsbook.
And that's Trevor Lawrence, who he had a coming-of-age game last week, right, against the Ravens. Looked tremendous, had that last-minute drive and the 2-point conversion. He was great. And he scored 19-plus points in 2 straight games now. He's got Detroit this week. They have given up 24-plus fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks in 3 of their last 4 games. So Trevor Lawrence is a very good play this week if you need help at quarterback. And then how about Jimmy Garoppolo? Now, I get it. Last week, he wasn't great, but he has thrown multiple touchdown passes in all but 2 of his last 7 games. And he's got the Dolphins this week. And I think this could be a shootout. I think this could really be a high-scoring game. And Miami's defense has allowed the 3rd most fantasy points to quarterbacks in all. 5 signal callers have beaten them for 18-plus points. Start Jimmy Garoppolo.
For your quarterback sits this week, you're sitting Kirk Cousins, despite his phenomenal performance on Thanksgiving Day, which I'm still a little bit upset about because I got beat in my Turkey Day Bowl at the last minute because of Kirk Cousins. I was leading. But anyway, we're sitting Kirk Cousins this week. And also, you say you're just done with Russ.
Yeah, I'm done. Listen, he's still a big name, and people may be starting him. I don't know why. He's been terrible. He's got 8 touchdown passes, folks. We're going into week 13. He's terrible. And you look at his numbers, he's had 2 good games all year. I don't know what's going on in Denver, but I do know one thing. They're not scoring any fantasy points. So Russell Wilson against the Ravens on the road, no thank you. I mean, at this point, Jen, even if you're in a 2 QB league, you're thinking about benching Russell Wilson. And you mentioned Kirk Cousins. And Kirk Cousins did something last week he typically doesn't do. He had a good game in prime time. This week, not in prime time, playing the Jets. The men in green, their defense is really good. They've allowed only 1 quarterback, Josh Allen, to score more than 12.3 fantasy points against them since week 4. So if you start Kirk Cousins, temper your expectations, but I think there are better options out there. Maybe the quarterback he's facing in that game.
Absolutely, and he's on your waiver wire. So if you want to start Mike White, I listen, the legend continues. It's unbelievable, Mike White. It's getting nuts. All right, let's jump over to the running back position. You have another player from the highest game total of the week. Again, that is the Detroit-Jacksonville matchup. We like a lot of players to start in your lineups this weekend from that game.
And Jamal Williams has been great. I mean, all the dude does is score touchdowns, right? I mean, 13 touchdowns this year. He continues to see the majority of the carries and touches in that backfield, even though DeAndre Swift seems to be healthy. I don't know what's going on there. But Williams is a guy that I'd play as an RB2 against the Jaguars. They've given up 11-plus fantasy points to 10 running backs, including 5 who scored more than 17. I also like David Montgomery, who is now getting the lion's share of the touches in Chicago's backfield because, of course, Khalil Herbert is on injured reserve. And I love the matchup this week. The Packers were awful against the Eagles and the run this past week. In fact, they gave up, over 300 rushing yards? I mean, it was unbelievable. Overall, their defense has given up 15 or more points to 8 different running backs this season. So David Montgomery is in a really good spot.
Yeah, no Khalil Herbert there. It seems like a smash spot for David Montgomery for sure. Okay, you are sitting Alvin Kamara this week, and also a guy that we thought was going to really go off last week versus Houston. I mean, he did score some touchdowns, but it was a bit underwhelming for what our expectations were.
So I'm not telling you to sit Alvin Kamara. I'm saying beware. Because, listen, I get it. If you've got Kamara, you got to play him, right? And this is almost like one of those reverse jinxes, Jen, where I'm hoping that if I tell everybody to sit him, that he wakes up. But Alvin Kamara has been bad. All right, in his last 4 games, 9.2 fantasy points per game. He's only averaging 13 touches a game. He's got the Buccaneers. They've given up the 3rd fewest points to running backs. Kamara's been a dud. I mean, he's had maybe 2 good games all year long. So if you're in DFS, don't touch him. But if you're in a traditional league and maybe you have depth at running back, it's not crazy to sit Alvin Kamara this week. And then you mentioned Jeff Wilson Jr. This is more of like a rage sit than anything else because he had 1 touchdown and averaged 3 yards a carry against Houston. And now he does have a revenge game this week against the San Francisco 49ers, but this defense has held Austin Eckler, stud, Alvin Kamara, okay, not so much a stud, and Javonte Williams, before he got hurt, to fewer than 12 fantasy points. It's a good run defense, and Jeff Wilson Jr. is coming off a very unspectacular performance. He is a flex at best.
I understand Dolphins and Niners Twitter is getting a little bit chippy, so if you want to get out your popcorn, you could follow some of those players and fans. I understand it's a pretty good show. Okay, let's go to the wide receiver position. All right, we've got another Jet here. Are we just pushing the chips in on Mike White? Are we crazy? What's going on here? I mean, Garrett Wilson's been phenomenal.
Listen, the Jets have a good team. I mean, they do, right? So, and Garrett Wilson's been good this year. He's had a bunch of stinkers, but he's a rookie. But last week, 26.4 fantasy points. He looked phenomenal. And that was against the Bears, and the Bears actually been tough against wide receivers. If you look at the numbers, the Vikings have not. They've allowed the most points to perimeter receivers. And with Mike White under center, the new hope in New York for Gang Green, I like Garrett Wilson as a wide receiver too in this matchup. And then I'm going back to the well with Christian Kirk. I liked him last week. He didn't have a great stat line. It was Zay Jones. But I'm going back to Kirk, and I'm going to say that he puts up a good line this week against the Detroit Lions. They have given up the fourth most fantasy points to slot receivers. Jen mentioned this is going to be a high-scoring affair. I would start Christian Kirk.
Again, we keep going back to that Jets game and that Jaguars game. There's a lot of starts there, and there are players you can get on the waiver wire. So if you can't get Christian Kirk, believe it or not, Zay Jones, who had 14 targets last week, available on 75% of waiver wires. So you can possibly put him in your flex position. Okay, as far as who you're sitting at wide receiver, we don't know if Aaron Rodgers is starting. You say it doesn't matter. It's probably just not a good idea to start Allen Lazard.
Yeah, the numbers have not been great, and his ceiling has taken a hit because all of a sudden Christian Watson's like Chris Carter. Like, all he does is score touchdowns. So Lazard's ceiling has taken a hit, and when you look at the numbers, fewer than 11 points in 3 straight games. And I mentioned the Bears actually are pretty tough against perimeter receivers, 5 touchdowns allowed, and the third fewest fantasy points allowed. So I'd fade Allen Lazard, and then Treylon Burks, who's been really good. Look at the numbers over the last couple of weeks, 35.1 combined points. But last week, he recovered a fumble for a touchdown. It still counts. But I wouldn't say that he had a spectacular performance last week. And now you got the Eagles and Darius Slay. They've given up the 5th fewest fantasy points to perimeter receivers. So even though Burks has been really good the last couple of weeks, I think he's no more than a low flex at best.
Let's jump over the tight end position. You got a couple guys here, one of whom has run a lot of routes this year and is yet again in that Detroit-Jacksonville game. And then you've got a guy who might have a new quarterback under center.
Right, and David Njoku, who will have Deshaun Watson under center this week. Last week he had a good game, 13.9 fantasy points. And the matchup, when you look at it, doesn't look great, right? Houston does not give up a lot of points to tight ends, but they haven't played any good tight ends. And the fantasy-relevant tight ends that the Texans have faced, they've actually had pretty good games. And David Njoku is certainly a fantasy-relevant tight end, so I start him this week. And then Evan Engram. Throw the dart. I understand, 7.6 combined fantasy points in his last 3 games. That stinks. But Detroit, you want to talk about something that stinks, their defense against tight ends. They've allowed 7 touchdowns and the 4th most points to tight ends. And by the way, 75% catch rate against Detroit. The tight end position has thrived against them. So if you're looking for help, Evan Engram is worth a look.
If you're able to sit someone at the tight end position, you say Tyler Higbee, though he's probably been the most reliable player for the Rams, you still don't want any part of that this weekend.
Here's the problem. The matchup is phenomenal, right? The Seahawks stink against tight ends, but Tyler Higbee didn't score a point last week. He didn't get a target last week. The Rams' offense is just trash. It is a dumpster fire and a dumpster fire. The quarterback position is a mess. And Higbee last week was a blocker on half of the plays that he was in. Like, that's not going to score us any fantasy points. So I get it. The matchup is great. Maybe you're desperate and you got to play him. He's probably going to be ranked at the low end of the tight end ones. But if we see the same thing we saw last week, Tyler Higbee's going to be a dud. And the same thing is going to go for Cole Kmet. The Bears have issues at the quarterback position. Justin Fields is banged up. Darnell Mooney's now out for the year, which means defenses can kind of focus on Cole Kmet if they need to, especially down in the red zone. And the Packers, for as bad as they've been lately, it's been mostly against the run. When you look at the numbers, 8th fewest fantasy points allowed to the tight end position. So they've been tough on tight ends. Cole Kmet, whether it's Justin Fields under center or not, I am fading him this week. Tight end's a mess.
There you go, folks. Those are the top start and sits of the week from Michael Fabiano. But if you want all of his rankings, you can always find them at si.com/fantasy. They're updated on a daily basis to keep you always in the know with the latest information, injuries, news, notes, etc. And by the way, before you leave here, you got to hit that subscribe button because we're going to continue to bring you video content all the way through your fantasy playoffs.